Okay, so Unit 11. Unit 11 is a little bit of a shorter unit. It has less theories and theoretical stuff, but it does have more names of people. So we'll get into the names of all of the intelligence theorists. So it is two parts to this unit. You have the intelligence, whether there's a single intelligence or multiple types of intelligence, and the people who theorize that. And then you also have how we test and assess and plot intelligence. So, excuse me, let's get into Spearman. In no particular order of importance or chronological order, one of the names that you'll see and need to know is this guy, Charles Spearman. Spearman was in the early part of the 20th century and was perpetuating the idea that there is one type of general ability, what's known as G, or general intelligence. And that's this idea that people are either highly intelligent, of average intelligence, of low intelligence, or somewhere in between. In other words, all of the mental talents that you have are very highly correlated. And that's not horribly inaccurate, because people who are really intelligent score high in a lot of different areas. I mean, you see that in your own peers, people who have really high grades in very difficult, left brain topics like, economics and physics and calculus and things like that. There's a lot of correlation between people of high intelligence who do well in a lot of different topics and people of low intelligence who don't score well in hardly any topics. And so it's hard to disprove general intelligence, but it may not be the full explanation of the story that we just have one type of intelligence, so there's not multiple intelligences. So sticking with the general intelligence idea, we have the French elementary school educator named Alfred Binet, and that's definitely a name that you would need to recognize if you see it. Binet's contribution to intelligence theory is that he wanted to better track his students based on their intellectual abilities. So students who had lower abilities would get more time and maybe be retained, and students who were of above average intelligence would advance quicker. And so he needed a way to test that, and he theorized and came up with a formula for what he called the intelligence quotient, or IQ. So not so much the test, but the idea that there was an intelligence quotient. And he did have an early version of his IQ test that has been changed and modernized a lot since its original inception. But the idea was to get an average intelligence based against your peers. And so the problem with the intelligence quotient, if we're being critical, is that it's really only a very telling statistic within reason against your peers when you're younger. So for instance, if someone say is 25 years old, you can get drastic changes in their mental age. So the formula is a pretty straightforward one. You have their mental age of how their mental capacities of what, say, a 16-year-old should be able to do, and their chronological age. And so you can really start to get some problematic numbers if you use this formula over time. So for instance, if someone had a mental age of 16 of MA and their chronological age was 25, then basically that gives you 0.64. If you multiply that by 100, then you're saying that person's mental age, or that person's IQ, is 64, which is extremely low functioning. And so that's to argue that the person with the mental age of a 16-year-old, their IQ could be that low. I mean, a 16-year-old who's on average with their peers, that's a high-functioning human being by the time you're 16 years old. So someone with the IQ of 64, that's going to be a lot more telling statistic when they're 8 or 9 years old than when they're 25 years old. And so as you get older in your chronological age, you see the numbers start to get really skewed. But what's good about the IQ score is that it is a comparative statistic, and so you get a bell curve, and that's when the mean, the median, and the mode are all the same, obviously, and you can see the bell curve where all of the 68% of the population fall within one standard deviation of really 100, which is 15 points in this case. So between an IQ score of 85 and 115 is roughly 70% of the population. So you don't see a lot of extremes, people whose IQs are extremely high or extremely low. And not to go back to the same slide a third time, again, I'm sorry, but using our hypothetical scenario, if your IQ was 64, you would fall in the bottom say 2 to 3% of all people in the world. So it's highly unlikely that this is a valid score after a certain age, but for purposes of what Alfred Binet needed it for, it was a useful way to assess children's intelligence. There had not been an intelligence test or quotient before that. So enter Wechsler. This is a guy's name that you need to recognize also. Kind of looks like Walt Disney. Wechsler is the guy that modernized and changed intelligence testing to eliminate a lot of the biases. There were knowledge bias and cultural bias, so language bias, and so his test is a little bit more accessible regardless of what your academic knowledge is, your crystallized intelligence, we'll say. And so he created the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, and since there has been an addition of the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, which is the WISC. So it's a little bit more accurate of a test. So let's get into some key terms for types of intelligence. We have factor analysis, we have fluid versus crystallized intelligence, and we have emotional intelligence. We talked about fluid and crystallized intelligence in a previous chapter, so we'll touch on it here briefly. But let's look at multiple intelligences. This is based on Howard Gardner's theory. Howard Gardner rejected Spearman's idea that there was one type of intelligence, that you could have a high IQ or a low IQ. Basically, Gardner believed that the brain was a complex membrane that could be very adept at one topic and not another one. So, for instance, he has 8 clusters of personality traits, of intelligence traits. You have interpersonal, people who are people smart, they can read other people and work with other people. You have intrapersonal, people who are able to self-reflect. You have linguistic, which would be word smart. You have logical mathematical, which would be logical smart people. Naturalists, which are nature smart. Spatial, which would be visual spatial, which people that are artistic or picture smart, as this guy Mark Kaiser shows us. We have body smart, bodily kinesthetic, and that's good body control. And you see some people who are great athletes have phenomenal body control, which is probably something that's in their brain more than anything else. You have musical abilities, the musical cortex in the brain, musical smart, and then you have basically some level in between of all of these things. So you could rank high in one category, low in another category. And to use potential evidence in favor of Gardner's theory, or at least in favor of multiple intelligence theory, you have things like savant syndrome, where people whose IQ score is extremely low, showing that their G, or general intelligence, would be very low. They're almost not functional in society, but yet they have extremely intense pockets of intelligence, like the ability to draw cityscapes to scale, or to know the names of every street in cities across America, addresses, musical notes, things like that. So that would kind of support different types of intelligence in the brain and not just one. Other key terms would be heredity versus environment, which is again the nature and nurture of intelligence. You have things like Down syndrome, fetal alcohol syndrome, and PKU. We'll look at that in the next slide. Twin studies. Twin studies come up big in intelligence because, again, if you have genetic copies, which would be identical twins, it's very rare that you get identical twins that are separated at birth, which would be beneficial for research purposes, but it would be sad for interpersonal purposes. But that would be the only way to really isolate nature from nurture, is if you had identical twins that were raised in different home environments that were drastically different. But other than that, I mean, even if you compare twins raised in the same household on how they do in various classes, like 2 twins that are fraternal take AP Calculus, one of them gets a B and one of them gets a D, right? But we have to eliminate the environmental factors. We have to eliminate the study time. We have to eliminate the distractions, all those things. So twin studies tell us a lot when you compare fraternal twins and you compare identical twins, because identical twins, obviously, unlike fraternal twins who are genetically no more similar than siblings, identical twins are exact genetic copies. This is a term that I've seen on the AP exam before, and it may not ring a bell when you look at it. It was not very highly highlighted in the textbook, but it is something that I've seen before. So let's point some attention at the Flynn effect. The Flynn effect is the idea that with increased nutrition and better medical knowledge and better technology, more access to information, and better education techniques, that we're essentially getting smarter with every generation. And the Flynn effect is not so much because of evolution we're getting smarter. It's the environmental things that make us smarter. So the Flynn effect is the fact that as time progresses, people become more intelligent. And then, of course, you have the environment heritability scale. How heritable is a trait versus how environmental is it. And then in human diversity, when we look at, say, like the scores, a lot of times you see these things. Like you'll see scores in certain countries. Like how does the Swedish AP scores rank against the American AP scores? How does South Korean AP scores rank against the Chinese scores? And even inside of cultural groups, you get what are black test scores in America versus what are black white test scores, and those things are problematic because you have diversity even inside of groups. You have diversity between groups. So when you look at the white and black achievement gap in America, that would be diversity between groups. But you also have within group differences. Obviously confounding variables. Being white does not make you more likely to do well in math, even if it's a predictive statistic. So you have diversity within groups, and then you have diversity between groups, and that can lead to things like the stereotype threat, which is the idea that we can judge whether or not someone will be more or less intelligent based on some group dynamic. Theory of multiple intelligences, Gardner, again, just to continue that, we have 3 areas of testing on traditional tests: logical, mathematical, verbal, linguistic, and spatial. And there's 5 areas, or the other 5 of Gardner's intelligences, quote unquote, that you can't really test on standardized testing. You can't test musical ability on a standardized test. You can't test bodily kinesthetic or body control. You can't test someone's naturalistic abilities or intrapersonal or interpersonal. And just so you know, a standardized test is the same test given to a large population that is scaled, right? That's scaled. So that's a standardized test. So something like FSA or an AP exam, those are standardized tests. Emotional intelligence is an underrated intellectual ability. The ability to perceive, express, understand, and regulate our emotions. It's not just empathy. It's not just interpersonal. It's intrapersonal. And children, very young children, lack emotional intelligence. They freak out and they throw a fit and they lose their minds, and we get mad at them and we say, "Oh, stop, losing your mind. Stop throwing a fit." And we threaten them with reinforcements and punishments and things like that. But the reality is that a child who lacks emotional intelligence, basically what they're having is an emotional crisis, according to Mayer and Salvoni. Basically, is that what their research shows is that children who lack emotional intelligence are people who have emotional disorders, things like being on the autism spectrum. Essentially, the way to explain that is that you are having an emotion, a feeling, that you have no explanation for. And that helps us empathize with little kids, because when little kids are throwing fits, they don't understand emotionally what they're dealing with. And that can help us a lot. A lot of research now on parenting is showing, even in coaching, whether it's parenting, coaching, teaching, tough love really doesn't work that well. Even if it's your bum teenager who won't get off the couch and stop smoking weed and get a job and move out, you really can't tough love people. You have to kind of be somewhat empathetic and help them facilitate their own decisions, which is easier said than done because we tend to get emotional and angry. But the reality is that emotional intelligence is a very high cognitive skill. It doesn't happen very early on in life. And that can help us whether you babysit or whether you have little siblings or whether you get in contact with little kids at camps or anyway. It will help you understand their emotional outbursts are not always attention seeking. They're sometimes an emotional crisis, and they don't really know how to navigate the emotions that they're experiencing, which is something that you experience when someone breaks up with you, or you have, you feel like you've been treated unfairly, or you've been accused of something by your teachers or by your parents that you didn't do, and you have this emotional outburst that you can't explain. And Freud would maybe say that you were regressing back to a childlike state, but the reality is that you probably just don't have the emotional intelligence to deal with the trauma or the sadness that you're experiencing, or the anger and the rage. It's something that you have to really learn from experience. Switching gears to Sternberg, this is another name of a multiple intelligence theorist. Sternberg believed that there were 3 types of intelligence, not 8, like Gardner did. And I don't know that he did this. I don't know that these people were all competing at the same time or had theories over each other, but these are just from their research study. So Sternberg believed the types of intelligences were analytical intelligence, creative intelligence, and practical intelligence. So basically, analytical intelligence would be the type of like crystallized intelligence or school smarts, book smarts. You do well in school, get good grades. The creativity gene, which would be you can, come up with creative solutions, think outside the box. But also you had an artistic side and spatial awareness and things like that. You could draw and paint or sculpt or act. And then there was a practical intelligence, which was, street smarts and wit. Your ability to handle your everyday tasks. So the triarchic theory by Sternberg I tend to like because it's very practical. Here's Howard Gardner. Gardner is our 8 intelligence guy. Here's Sternberg, and he's our 3 intelligence guy. And that's analytical, creative, and practical. We'll get into the heritability of intelligence. Heritability intelligence refers to trait differences among a population, not trait differences among yourself. So in other words, the best way to describe this is you are not 50% your mom and 50% your dad. Like, well, that half of your intelligence comes from me and that half comes from your dad. That's not how heritability works. When it says 50%, it means that if we take a population of people who has a similar environment, so for instance, if we take Gulf Breeze High School and we go to the lunchroom and we pull all of the 10th grade kids and we give them an intelligence test and we plot their IQ scores. That's the heritability of their IQ, because in theory their environment is the same or similar enough. So the changes then would be genetic. So again, you've heard heritability several times with the plants in various chapters. Even in the last chapter, chapter 10, we talked about heritability. This is this idea that if we can isolate environment, we can prove nature. But if we can isolate nature and biology, then we can prove environment. So heritability has got this fancy definition of 50% of the time among trait differences among a group, 50% of the time. What that means is not one person is 50% their mom and 50% their dad. It means that we can take a population of people and we can separate them based on genetics, right? So, and another good example, if we take IQ out of it, IQ might be environmental, but let's take something that's non-environmental, like eye color or height. If we go in if we go in the cafeteria at Gulf Breeze High School, again, same scenario, and we take all of the, let's say, seniors and not sophomores, because the confounding variable is they may still be going through puberty. Sorry, sophomores. So we take the seniors, ages 17 and 18, and we randomly assign them to go stand on the wall, and then we measure them by height. Well, the reason why one person is 6'2" and one person is 5'2", and the reason why one person is 5'6" and the other person is 6'1" is not because of environment, right? So one person is not 5'2" because they don't get enough nutrients. They're 5'2" because their parents, they inherited their parents' height. And again, it's not 50-50. If you're 5'2", or 5 feet tall, it's not because your dad is 6 feet tall and your mom is 4 feet tall, and you're half of each. It's not how it works. You're a combination of their genetics, yes, but heritability means that you're shorter than the guy standing next to you because of genetics and not because of environment. Now, if you were stunted because no one fed you, or you came from another place where they ate different nutrient contents, or you had a different diet, yeah, maybe we could say that it was environmental. But heritability is all about what can we prove that is genetic by looking at a population that has a similar environmental impact. All right. Down syndrome. Oh, we talked about Down syndrome, PKU, and fetal alcohol syndrome. So let's get into some intellectual, genetic, speaking of heritability, genetic malformation. So Down syndrome is a specific chromosomal anomaly that is genetic. It heads through, passes down through generations. It is a chromosomal anomaly. It is a copy of the 21st chromosome. So a person is born with an extra 21st chromosome, an extra set of chromosome. So it is a genetic defect. It affects intellectual abilities, physical changes. You can see that affects in the skeletal structure of a person who suffers from Down syndrome. It does not necessarily affect the emotional intelligence of a person like the autism spectrum disorders would. Autism spectrum is not going to affect intelligence, but it will affect emotional intelligence. Whereas Down syndrome is kind of the opposite. It may affect intellectual abilities, but not emotional intelligence, the ability to understand and experience emotions. But it does affect, it comes with a lot of health effects, unfortunately. It does affect the the life expectancy and life span and independence and health complications of people who suffer from Down syndrome. Fetal alcohol syndrome is environmental, unlike Down syndrome, which is genetic. Fetal alcohol syndrome is obviously when a developing fetus in utero or during the prenatal process it has exposure to alcohol. Then essentially what you get is fetal alcohol syndrome, or FAS, and that's something that can affect people cognitively, intellectually, but also physically. There are definite signs of physical malformations that come from fetal alcohol syndrome. And then PKU, interaction of nature and nurture. Whereas Down syndrome is genetic, fetal alcohol syndrome is environmental. PKU can be triggered by environmental factors, but based on diet and hormonal changes and things like that. But it's also something that is genetic. So born without the ability to break down certain amino acids. Phenylalanine is specifically where the P comes from in PKU, but essentially it can be environmental from the standpoint of it's like some other chromosomal anomalies that both parents have to be carriers. Right, there's other types of genetic disorders that you can get. You can get iron deficiencies, and you can get sickle, like anemias and things like that, where you have two carriers, right? So passed on to the child from both parents. If only from one, then they are just a carrier, and they do not suffer from the inability to break down specific amino acids. So that brings us to the end of Unit 11. Short and sweet for that one. Just be advised of all the different intellectual theorists that go along with Unit 11.